So as we saw, it's very natural and intuitive for us to think of visual processing as this single stepwise processing of information that begins at the retina and ends, at least at the visual cortex or farther, where we're building towards a reconstruction of important features of the world. We're creating a single general purpose representation that will guide all our interactions with the world, that is, all our visually driven interactions with the world. But as I suggested, it looks like that's probably naive, that very intuitive way of thinking about how we work is in fact an inaccurate understanding of how we work. And it took a lot of research and pulling apart to really get at what was going on here. But you can start to think about why it is that we don't need one single general purpose representation when we start to think about what kind of spatial representations we need to interact with the world in different scenarios. So the first scenario is just interacting with objects in our immediate environment, right? Picking up things, moving around things, and so on. For that, what we really need is an egocentric body-centered representation. That is, a representation where the origin is us, maybe our head or maybe our body, that positions everything in the world relative to that origin and relative to the position of our body so that we can facilitate our grabbing things, reaching around, moving around, and so on. And so an egocentric body-centered representation is centered on the immediate domain relative to our body parts. Its function is to interact with objects with our body. When we want to move around in the larger visual scene, still within the area that we can directly see, for example, we might want something like an egocentric perspectival representation scheme. Here we're thinking about a representation of the visual scene that's centered on the visual scene relative to us, so we're still kind of the origin. Everything is measured relative to us, right? But now the scope is much larger. And the function here is the navigation in our immediate local environment, the things that we can see directly in our vision, our visual scene, but not just the stuff that we're reaching for or grabbing for or moving around. And so we have landmark-driven navigation, and this is facilitated by this different resolution of an egocentric spatial mapping. Now, when we think about when we want to go someplace that we don't see, right? When we think about we want to know where we are relative to other places in our house or in our city and so on, then what we really need is an allocentric representation of space. That is, what we need is an environment centered. So we have a representation of the environment and we have a representation of where we are in that environment so that we now see ourselves inside the environment and we can judge where we need to go even if we can't see it, right? Because now we have this spatial representation of this larger environmental context within which we can work. And the function here is general longer-term navigation that is scene-centered navigation, but is beyond what's immediately seeable and not driven so strongly by landmarks as opposed to relative position. And this kind of spatial relation-driven navigation is important for us to get around in the world because we go beyond what we can see at any given moment in time. So let's look at each of these a little more carefully. Now, here's a quote from a paper from 2006 about this body-centered egocentric visual mapping. So they say, we present a view of the posterior parietal cortex, which we'll look at in the next lecture, as a sensory motor interface for visually guided movements. Special attention is given to the role of the posterior parietal cortex in arm movement planning, where representations of target position and current hand position and eye-centered frame of reference appear to be mapped directly to a representation of motor error and in hand-centered frame of reference. This mapping is direct in the sense that it does not require target position to be transformed into intermediate reference frames in order to derive the motor error signal in hand-centered coordinates. Now, what does all that mean? Well, essentially what it means is we need a representation of the immediate visual scene that places our hand in position relative to objects on the same scale so that we can know where we're reaching. We can know whether or not, when we see our hand moving, whether it's accurate or inaccurate in its reach, orientation, and so on. So we can sort of think of our egocentric body-centered representation as a spatial mapping that starts from our body at the center, and that allows us to place objects relative to our body and incorporate into it the position of part and orientations of parts of our body for the purposes of interacting with those objects in that immediate short-term resolution. When we want to go out and navigate around in the world that we see immediately before us, we go places in the visual scene that we can see right now, right? Then it seems like what we need is a representation that is egocentric still, right? Still focused on us as its origin. Everything is measured relative to us, but the resolution is much greater. There's greater distance resolution, right? And our function here is the navigation of the immediate local environment. So it's landmark driven. So we're identifying places we want to go or things that we have to avoid. We're moving from here to there and so on. Now, to kind of give you a sense of what that spatial representation would look like, I'll show you 2 pictures from an optical illusion. So here's a picture, right, where we're looking at these people who are seemingly walking on air here, right? Seems like this room goes down, top of it is black, then it goes down white, and people are just walking around in the middle of the air there. Now, when we switch perspectives, we get a different spatial representation of the nature of the world here, different interpretation of the depth cues and so on. So if we go to the other side of the room and we stand right over here and look this direction instead of standing over here looking this direction, what do we see? Well, we see a completely different world. We lose that 3-dimensional depth interpretation of the floor. It now looks like a flat surface with people laying on it, because now we're not standing up on that little pedestal looking down on this floor. Instead, we're looking from across the room at the pedestal and across the floor. And so now we have a quite different representation of ourselves and our relative positions to objects that we can use to navigate around it. Finally, our allocentric visual mapping. Here's a quote from Aronov et al. And so they say, during spatial navigation, neural activity in the hippocampus and the medial intraohenial cortex, sorry, dyslexia is kicking in, is correlated to navigational variables such as location, head direction, speed, and proximity to boundaries. These activity patterns are thought to provide a map-like representation of the physical space. So what's going on here? Well, here we're talking about moving around in the space that is larger than what we can immediately see, possibly, and that we want to be able to think about where we are relative to all sorts of objects in front of us, behind us, to the side of us, and so on, right? So if you wanted to go to school, right, and you weren't looking at school, right, it wasn't directly in your visual scene, how would you know which way to go? What direction would you do? Well, you need to be able to think of yourself in a larger environment and think of yourself relative to those things. So remember those rats in Tolman's experiment, right? When he changes the configuration of the maze, they don't just start randomly searching around. They start searching around in the general direction of where the goal box used to be. So they have a spatial map still. And even though the landmarks change, they use that spatial map to try and figure out how to get to where they want to go anyway. So the idea of an allocentric reference frame then is an environment-centered map of the environment that places the perceiver in the environment. It's no longer the origin. The perceiver is just another object in this larger map. And the function of this is general long-term navigation that's scene-centered. That is, that's navigation around the world driven by the world itself and our relationship to the objects within that world. So spatially driven navigation. So we see three different kinds of maps, two egocentric maps with different resolutions, right? And one allocentric map that seem to facilitate different kinds of movement in our environment, movement with objects in our immediate grasp, movement within the larger environment relative to where we are, and movement in an environment when we're no longer at the center of the environment. We no longer necessarily see where we want to go, but we want general orientation in a larger context. None of these things are really what Marr had in mind when he was thinking of visual processing. But research in how we actually solve problems, looking at the behavior, looking at the teleological functional elements of movement, this is what researchers started to settle on, or around the 90s and 2000s.